Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, it is my honor to have with me as my guest on the podcast, Ahava Shira. Ahava Shira is a journal writer, memoirist, poet, performer, dancer, and visual artist. She is the author of a collection of poetry entitled Weaving of My Being, the creator of a spoken word audio recording called Love is Like This, and the co-author of the book Writing Alone Together, Journaling in a Circle of Women for Creativity, Compassion, and Connection. Ahava holds a Ph.D. in language and literacy education from the University of British Columbia, where she developed the arts-based contemplative practice of loving inquiry. As a creative midwife, she helps women develop the confidence and freedom to express themselves through writing and other creative arts. Ahava Shira, welcome to the person you want to be.
Wow, that's an invitation. I accept gladly, Eric. Lovely to
Excellent.
be here.
I'm so glad to have you here. So, to start things off, I'd love for you to reflect back, if you will, on your earliest childhood memories and specifically your earliest sense that you had of who it was or what it was you wanted to be or you wanted to do. And if you could also, just for the sake of some context, paint a picture of the environment in which you grew up.
I pause and you'll get used to that because I like to take my time. My students get used to that actually, my pauses. And because there's such a rich question, it's nice simply to hang out with it. So when I think back to my childhood and those kind of insinuations of who I might be, the first image that came to me was dancing in the living room of my mother's house on the green carpet with an audience of my bubby. I think it was both my bubbies, my big bubby and my little bubby. That's what we call them because literally my big bubby, my mother's mother, was large woman, tall and buxom, and my father's mother, my little bubby, was shorter, stout, but shorter. And for some reason, I don't remember my grandfather's or my Zadie's. One I was named after, so he died 9 months before I was born, so he wasn't there. But I don't remember my Zadie. It's my two bubbies, and I remember their welcome appreciation of my dancing. I probably was singing too. I wouldn't be surprised. So that's the image that came to me, which is a very joyful image. The other one is in my bedroom, and I was also dancing and singing. And in there, though, the music I was listening to, one of my favorite albums and movies from my childhood was A Star is Born with Barbra Streisand and Chris Christopherson. And I loved the music, and I loved both of them. I loved the love story. And there were especially a couple of songs that really resonated with me, and I'm going to share because I love to sing, and I wouldn't necessarily call myself a singer. I want to learn what life is for. I don't want much, I just want more. Ask what I want and I will sing. I want everything. Everything. So that's one I used to sing over and over, and it goes on and on. I heard Barbra Streisand talking about that song many, 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 many years later. And she said something really interesting about it, which was that when she was writing it, she was, and when, or I guess probably co-authoring it and singing it, it was an anthem to feminism. It was an anthem to women and to herself, giving herself permission to really come out into the world and want those things that traditionally women hadn't been offered or led to believe that they were possible for them. For me, it was a dreaming into my own sense of what was possible. And I think that one of the big that I would discover later on, I think, was this sense of learning and my love of learning, my passion. My practice that I developed through my PhD is called loving inquiry or inquiry. And that to me, the constant unfolding of experience and expression and being curious and open, that harkens back for me to that song. And I want to learn what life is for. So
What?
that's what comes to mind for me. And Barbra Streisand's a good one to talk about because I did grow up in the Jewish community in Montreal with actually in a really interesting house. My mother is an identical twin, and my aunt's family lived upstairs, and we lived downstairs in a duplex, which they still live in. They're 84, going to be
Wow.
85 next month. The twins still live in that house. That's I can give my age away now very very quickly, which because they've been in that house for 57 years, and I was born in that house a year after they got there. So I'm not afraid to say how old I am. You're not supposed to reveal your age as a woman or something. I don't know. But anyways, there you go. And it was a very, it was a very rich and happy and also very confusing and chaotic and harsh environment to grow up in. It was a lot of different things. There was a lots of joy, and I think there was music and culture, more of secular culture. We weren't religious, but there was also a lot of unhealthy dynamics relationally between my parents and myself and other members of the house. And yeah, it was a rich a rich soup, like a chicken soup of of living of my formative years. I just think interesting. I've never thought about my formative years as chicken soup, but it's just coming to me with the sense of my Jewish my Jewish background. So chicken soup for the soul. There you go. My
What a
soul had much to learn or something, right? There's the learning.
what a beautiful answer. And I think you're the first person that has incorporated singing into the answer to that question. What I hear there is a very natural desire to express yourself as a kid, and also an appetite for life, and especially with the lyrics that you sang. Um, an appetite for learning, but also an appetite for living. You wanted more. You wanted,
Mm.
so that's a great picture that you painted. Thank you for that. So you were kind enough to share with me. You have a memoir that you've written. It's called Curve, and you were kind enough to share with me a significant portion of it, even though it is as of yet unpublished. Thank you for that. That really helped me get to know you a bit better, and certainly the complexity, the complex soup in which you grew up in was really elucidated in your memoir in a powerful way. I mean, you really captured, I think, the mixture of things, positive and negative, very well. So one thing I'm curious about is that in the memoir, your your relatives refer to you as Alana, but you refer to yourself as Ahava. So could you speak to that?
Hmm. Hmm. I was named, and they called Alana,
Oh, Alana. Okay.
And that's okay. So I was named at birth. My parents gave me the name Alana, which is so the English name, Alana. But in the Jewish tradition, at birth, children are also given a Hebrew name. And because my parents didn't speak Hebrew, the rabbi named me.
Hmm.
And I was named after my grandfather. I mentioned my grandfather died before I was born, 9 months before I was born. So I was conceived sometime around his, his mourning, his
That's
Shiva, which
fascinating.
is,
Yeah.
yeah, very, very fascinating. I have a poem about that actually, from death into life, right? So
Well, his
um,
name was.
his name was Abraham or Avraham. And so the rabbi gave me the name Ahava. Now it's a very unusual name because, and I'm playing with my necklace because I really want it to be here with me. Maybe I'll talk about that later.
Okay.
But I just want to acknowledge, silly Ahava. Um, Ahava is in Hebrew is pronounced Ahava, and it is the Hebrew word for love. So growing up, I went to Jewish day school full time from kindergarten to grade 11. So I studied Hebrew. I even studied Yiddish for until grade 6. And then I switched to a different school. So I studied English, French because I was in Montreal, and then Hebrew. And I read it. I wrote, I had 15 hours of Hebrew a week in my later years of high school and wrote long papers in Hebrew. It was something that very familiar to me. And in my classes, when we used to learn, I was Ahava in my Hebrew classes. So I had both names in high school. And when we learned to write letters, that then you would sign them Ba'ahava, and I would say Ba'ahava, Ahava, right? With love, Ahava. So there was something about, of course, simply being named love that was special and unique, and I enjoyed that. And then in my very early 20s, at the threshold, now I see, of this, of adulthood, and also this stepping beyond the cultural world that I grew up in and the identification with that. And the I chose to change my name full time to Ahava. So I dropped Alana and became Ahava. And I was at a place called the Esalen Institute,
Mm-hmm.
which is a spiritual center, holistic healing center in Big Sur, California. You know this because you're a
Yes.
Californian. And I spent a winter there in 1990, 91. And in one of my classes, psychodynamic, creativity class, the teacher asked us, we did these dyads and we were asking each other, what are you pretending? So it's like Eric, what are you pretending? Eric, what? And then vice versa. Alana, at that point, what are
Mm-hmm.
you pretending? So we did that for a while, and then she said, "Okay, well, let's let's go to our separate corners." She gave us these big pieces of paper, and she said, "Okay, now that I'm not pretending, I will." There might have been a step in the middle of that. We might have had a couple of minutes each of, if I wasn't pretending, I would, or something like that. And then she gave us these big pieces of paper. We were on our own, and now that I'm not pretending, I will. And so I wrote, now that I'm not pretending, I will change my name to Ahava because I am love. And I even added there was beauty in there somehow. I am love and beautiful. I don't have the piece of paper, but it's so etched in my mind because it was such a significant moment. And this is who I am, and I want to go by that name.
Beautiful.
So that's how became, Alana became Ahava.
Hmm. I love the generality of that prompt. I am pretending. I mean, you could answer that with whatever, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
It's a very interesting invitation. And then
mm-hmm,
if I weren't pretending, I would,
mm-hmm,
because it's not relegated to any particular
mm-mm.
domain or dimension. So it's just
Yeah.
whatever, however that calls to you, however that yeah, sounds to you. That's very interesting. And I like how you owned your name, you claimed it for yourself because it was who you wanted to be. It was the person you wanted to be, right? You wanted to be love.
Yes, and that, I had been dreaming about it a little bit in the years. After I moved out of my house and moved downtown Montreal and started to waitress and bartend at this little cafe called Upstairs, but it was actually downstairs, so the sign was turned upside down. It was a jazz cafe in Montreal on Crescent Street. No, it was on Bishop, one off of Crescent, which is the hub, the place to be, where I used to go dancing as a teenager. And what was I going to say? Yeah, I love this. I've lost my train of thought. Isn't that great? What was I responding to? I saw for some reason I got pulled into. Oh, I was dreaming into the name already a little bit. I was dating this man, who was such an interesting man. Ran a repertory cinema, and we used to go to this place called Peel Pub, and we'd drink beer, and we would watch. They had these trivia games, and to be on a part of it, you had to have a name. And so I used to use the name Ahava as like my nickname kind of thing. I was testing it out there. So that was like a few years, a year and a half, 2 years before I actually did the official switch. So I was already starting to kind of, there's something here for me. There's something more. Let's go back to, something more. And that question, or that invitation that I started to sing, I want to learn what life is for. In naming myself love, I was calling in this journey that I was embarking on. And that was learning love. That how does one become love, or how does one learn love, how to love oneself, how to love others. I saw a lot of not love growing up. I felt love and I felt other things. And it became important for me to understand and create some kind of a different environment for myself in the world. And so that was the stepping into that new journey, was by naming myself love.
Yeah. Did your parents or other family members continue to refer to you, call you Alana? Because that's how it appeared in the book.
Oh yeah. My mother has, I guess in high school at some point, she made us rings with our names on them. And my mother has been wearing my Alana ring I think just about all my adult life. And she still calls me Alana, and she says it in a very, Alana. She's a Jewish mother. And my father goes back and forth, sometimes
Interesting.
Alana, sometimes Ahava. My sister mostly calls me Ahava. My cousins kind of goes back and forth. Now, because I left and moved all the way across the country, I am less exposed to people who knew me as Alana and more to Ahava. So, yeah.
Right. In the memoir, you offer a description of what it felt like to experience your parents fighting when you were a kid. And you wrote, I remember how I feel when they fight like this at home, as if I am holding my breath underwater, but no one is timing me. So I just have to keep holding and holding, never knowing when I'll get to open my mouth and breathe in. That's a powerful description. I imagine a lot of people can relate to it, even if they didn't have the exact circumstances, even if it was not exactly in the context of their parents fighting. It's this sense of it not being safe to breathe, right? Not being safe to just fully be yourself. That's beautiful. I really, really appreciated a lot of things about the portion of the manuscript that you shared with me. One of them is I really like how you write it in the present tense for immediacy. And the way that you structure it is it's basically a series of vignettes, but they have a certain continuity to them in the way they're presented visually on the page, at least in the version that I saw of it. And so it has a certain visual style to it as well, and definitely a poetic flair to it throughout, even though you are writing in prose. So it's a very, I think it's a very unique expression. You did a good job of making it your own, just even stylistically, in addition to the obviously very personal story that you share in the memoir. I want to ask you now, the title of the memoir, as I mentioned, is Curve. And I really kept appreciating the significance of the title as I kept reading, because first of all, curve can be a noun, it can be a verb. And on the surface, I think one of the most obvious reasons you chose that was your scoliosis condition. And as a kid, you had to wear orthopedic braces, right, to stop this curve, um, to keep it in line. And you actually I don't know if you named the braces or they were named for you, but one of them was called Boston and the other was called Milwaukee.
Yeah,
Right?
they named them
They
actually.
named
That's what
them.
they literally, yeah, that's the,
Or was
the
it
technical
The
terms.
Boston and the Milwaukee? I can't
I
remember.
think it was the Boston
Yeah.
and the Milwaukee. Yeah.
So what comes to mind when you remember, first of all, how long did you have to wear those braces for? And what effect did it have on you having that condition? I'm guessing you were something of an anomaly, being the kid with scoliosis. What comes to mind just in adolescence is painful enough, I think it's safe to say, for pretty much everyone. And then when you have these things that make you additionally self-conscious or call attention to you, or make you, different from others your age, it can be painful. So what is your memory of dealing with the scoliosis?
Well, that's an interesting way to ask the question. What is my memory? From someone who has spent many years remembering or, working with memory and the stories,
Hmm.
um, to think about what is my memory, because there, like I said, there's memory is a part of storytelling and a part of memoir, and then there's more to it than that, because there's narrative, there's poetry, there's meaning making as a part
Right.
of it. So it was challenging. I was alone in it. There were no support groups for scoliosis kids,
Hmm.
certainly none that I belonged to. There wasn't any space that I remember to talk about it, probably a little bit to my friends. I felt very awkward and I was very self-conscious. And it wasn't so much, I didn't have a lot of physical pain. Uh, I didn't like it. I didn't like having to wear something on my body. I didn't like that I had to wear them 22 hours a day. And I say them because I started off with this smaller Boston brace that kind of went over my torso. And then because this curve kept growing, I got this Milwaukee brace, which was it was from that smaller one, had a metal rod or actually twin rods that came up my chest, like came up on either side basically of my spine, but in the front, but two, and then one in the back, and then met. I think
Hmm.
I describe it as this collar of steel, and with padding, foam padding to make it somewhat comfortable. And I had to wear that at night actually. So I wore the smaller one during the day to school, which I could hide somewhat, but the big one I could not hide. And so the doctor let me actually not wear that one to school, but to wear it. But I did sleep in it for at least a few years. So I wore the braces from the time I was 13 and a half until I was 17 and a half, about.
Hmm. So your scoliosis was obviously an unpleasant and, difficult ordeal that made you self-conscious. You said it wasn't physically painful, But obviously, it interfered, I'm guessing, with you, obviously on an emotional level, perhaps on a social level. And then this, speaks again to the title of your book, Curve, which can also refer to those unexpected twists and turns in life, as well as to the literal curve of your spine. So, what prompted the decision, or what went into the decision to have the surgery, the spinal fusion surgery? And I also, before you get into that, I want to just quote again from Curve, from your book. On this subject, you wrote, "I've been asking myself how it is possible I can feel this alive, this free and this pained, this sore and soaring. On the dance floor, my arms lithe and graceful, legs feverish as Ginger Rogers, torso supple as a swan's neck. With 15 vertebrae fused together, how is it possible?" So that I'm guessing was a big decision. And what did the surgery entail? What did it consist of? And how was it possible that is it possible that you've been able to continue dancing and remain flexible ever since? Because that's, to me, kind of stunning.
Yeah, it's still stunning to me too, actually. The spine kept curving in scoliosis. It's a it's a it's not a lateral curve. So it's a no, sorry, it is a lateral curve actually. So the spine kept curving, and therefore the braces weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing, which was to stop the curve. And I
Hmm.
was still, so they waited until I stopped growing, which was around 17 and a half. And it was really typical in those years for, I think the orthopedic surgeon at the time was doing one of those a week or something. Maybe actually that's not even so many. There's still so many, uh, they're still doing a lot of spinal fusion surgeries in different ways. I was so tired of wearing these braces on my body that in some ways, naively, I was like, bring it on. Okay,
Hmm.
let's do this. At least by fusing my spine, I won't have to wear the braces anymore, and that'll be that. That was their way of fixing it, right? That was the cure. So I went into the hospital and spent 10 days. The surgery was 4.5 hours, and they did literally what they do is they grafted bone from my hip and then put it in between each of those 15 vertebrae. And then they put a steel rod alongside the spine with wires. And then the rod is really only there for the first 6 months while the bone grows.
Hmm.
And then it's the bone that does the fusion of the
Wow.
vertebra together.
Huh.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
So
Did
I do
they,
know some people, go ahead.
I was going to say, did they tell you what about the risks involved? And do you remember what those were?
I don't remember any risks at all. There were risks in not doing it, which was
Right.
because the spine could keep curving and there was a risk of collapsed lungs, etc. So the risk was really in not doing it. I don't remember in the risks in doing it. And
Hmm.
I already was, as you know from that first memory, I was always dancing. And I kept dancing all throughout the time that I wore the braces on my body. I still danced.
Hmm.
Don't forget, I was in a Jewish community with lots of bar mitzvahs and lots of sweet 16s. And so there was these glorious, glamorous parties night after night for a year and a half when I was 13, 14, and another year and a half when I was 16, 17, 15, 16, 17. And I danced right through with the
Hmm.
braces on. And
Wow.
then they fused my spine, and you would think, how can you dance? How can you do anything with 15 vertebrae fused together? So that's all of my thoracic, the 12 thoracic and the first three lumbar fused. And for the first 6 months, they gave me this much more intense brace, much like the Boston, but it had a piece that came up that was sort of a plastic piece that I couldn't hide. And I was in in Montreal, the years between high school and university are called CEGEP. It's a 2-year sort of pre-university college called CEGEP. And it was really upsetting to have to wear that brace because I couldn't hide it. And I was so self-conscious.
Hmm.
But it was only 6 months. And but I had to wear that brace 24 hours a day, actually, for the 6 months, except I was allowed to take it off for a little bit when I was lying down. I even had a separate brace for the shower. And then I think after 3 months, I could take a shower without the brace. And then it went back on. So after that 6 months, like I'm sure you can imagine how thrilling it was to get the brace finally off. So they offered me this sort of intermediate brace where that was more fabric and different things. They said if you're doing any intensive sports, you have to wear that. I did not do anything for I would not go near another brace. So I just kept things light. I probably still danced, but I didn't do anything other than that. I used to ski and etc., but I didn't do anything. I kind of laid low until my time was up. And then that was it. Then I started, living in the world in this body with a fused spine. And curiously, I started to discover, I kept dancing and I started to discover all these wonderful practices of dance, beginning with Esalen, that were about letting the body be free in its movement, which I had already done I grew up in the 80s, right? I was dancing on disco squares, at a lot of those parties, right? So I was doing the hustle, the bump, all these kinds of great dances. And I started to discover this conscious dance, inner dance, 5 rhythms dance, authentic movement. So all these alternative forms of movement that drew on the natural inclination in me to move my way.
Hmm.
And so I made it possible for me to keep moving exactly as I was, because I just pursued that. I pursued that and learned the connection between the emotional and the body and the movement, and learned the aesthetic and dramatic and the body moving and the poetic. When I started to write poetry and perform poetry, I would move my body as I was performing. I found all these different ways of accessing the movement as my body could do it. I found contact improv, that was another one. So lots of different modalities, all centered around dance movement, where I could be as free as I possibly could, despite the fusion in my spine.
Was it a fairly seamless experience, or really were you testing the waters and kind of doing what your body would allow?
Yeah, in some ways it's fascinating because I didn't necessarily know what my body would allow. I get in some ways like I was pushing it, or any kind of movement in a sense felt like a process of discovery. I still do it when I'm moving in my living room or moving on a dance floor somewhere. I don't necessarily know what the body can do because it's fused. So I follow my heart and I follow this gorgeous impulse to move and feel the pleasure and the rhythm and the life force. It's like boom, boom, like, the heart, like that life force that you named, the more I follow, the more. And then however it unfolds. And sometimes I kind of get a little scared. Really? Can my body do this? Can it do this? But it lets me know if it can't.
Just just as it does for anyone, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And I would imagine it also has come to inform your own style, just because our physicality is going to, fused spine or not, is going to inform our style of movement. So I think it's all very fascinating. And I'm happy for you that it did not impede your dancing. And I also kind of wonder if dedication to movement and dance or otherwise has been part of your, like, has been helpful in dealing with the fused spine, as opposed to just being sedentary, not moving. It seems like it would be, but what do I know? I don't know.
It makes a lot of sense if my so much of my body can't move that I at least do what I can and to keep it moving as much as it does move, right? I can't imagine. So I think it was a intuitive and really a naturally authentic mode of expression for me. And I think there's wisdom in it because um, keeps that as my body as flexible as it can be.
Right. Which I'm guessing is, significantly more flexible than a lot of people.
Mhm.
Just from having
Most
seen,
people, yeah, most
yeah,
people can't tell when they look at me, and
right.
they are very surprised. What? You have
Yeah.
15 vertebrae fused together? How is that possible? There's the how is it possible?
Yeah.
And I
Right.
feel that way sometimes too. How is it possible? Yeah, it is. It's it's one of those paradoxes, life paradoxes, right? Pleasure and pain, and limitation and liberation.
Oh, that's great. I love that. That's a great phrase. So at 20 years of age, you went on a 3.5 month solo backpacking trip through Europe. I want to hear about this. I want to hear about what the impetus for that was. And also connected to that, because one of our points of connection is journaling. And we met through the journaling community, basically. The IAJW, the International Association for Journal Writing, which the woman who directs that currently, her name is Linda Monk, and she's been a previous guest on this podcast. And I know she's a very close friend of yours.
And my co-author also.
Right, on the book that I
Writing
mentioned in
Alone
your
Together.
introduction. Right.
Mhm.
So so you took this backpacking trip, pretty gutsy thing, 20 years old by yourself. And the significant thing is that my understanding is that that was also the first time you ever kept a journal. So I would love to hear about what prompted the trip and what gave you the idea to start journaling.
I was at McGill University at the time. And the year before, some of my friends from high school were preparing to travel with each other to Europe. It was one of the things that my cohort of friends did when we graduated from high school or CJAP. We kind of went to Europe for the summer. There's a privilege there that we had.
Hmm.
So we were supposed to, and then there were the bombings. So it was 1983 that there were the bombings in Europe, and we decided not to go. It wasn't safe. Was that? No, sorry, that was not in 83. It was 86. The bombings were in Europe because by the next year, I had started to become more distant from these friends. So I was starting to discover other parts of me and feeling not as connected to them. And so I decided to go traveling by myself instead of traveling with them. And as a matter of fact, they did go together and I did end up meeting up with them toward the end of the trip.
Hmm.
But I chose to go by myself. And part of it was I did a 6-week program where I studied German in Germany and lived with a German family. And I chose to study languages as a part of my bachelor's degree because I wasn't really sure what else to study. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And languages, because I grew up in the Jewish school system where I studied so many languages, English, French, Hebrew, and Yiddish, I already had this propensity toward it, and they were fun. There was a lightness to it, and I didn't find myself attracted to the headier academic subjects. So languages, in some ways, I think it was partly the leading into the writing that I already was a writer then, but didn't necessarily know it, and the languages were part of that. And also that there was, it was cultural and it was playful, and I enjoyed it. So and German is similar to Yiddish. There's a lot of vocabulary that's similar. I mean, I know it can be a bit strange to think of the history of, my ancestors from Eastern Europe and the Holocaust. Why would I even want to study German? But my family was touched definitely by the Holocaust. All of my grandfather's sisters died in the Holocaust. But my other grandparents came over way before then, in the early 20th century, or even like late 19th century. So uh, it wasn't as close to me as some of my other friends or people in my life right now, and it wasn't something that I needed to be. It didn't stop me from that pull toward that language as one language that might be interesting to study. And I actually loved the German language, and it turned
Hmm.
out that I went to this small town called Kassel and lived with a German family for 6 weeks. And the mother was a German language teacher, and the father was a judge. And they took me to the synagogue in the town, which was
Wow.
quite small. And I got to meet the community. We had lots of conversations about my being Jewish and the history. And we did a lot of traveling through Germany.
Was the family
And
you stayed with Jewish or not?
no, and they weren't Jewish.
Hmm. But they took you to the synagogue.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
knew all because I was Jewish, and they were quite cultured, and they wanted me to experience it.
Hmm.
They were honoring who I was, right? What mattered to me and my heritage. So it was a really wonderful experience, and it's a very rich language, the German language, actually. It has some really interesting ways of conjugating sentences. The sentence structure is fascinating. And so again, it was tapping into my own propensity
Hmm.
to language, to words, the play of words, and yeah.
So what about the journaling? Where did that come in? And did you journal
Ah,
in exclusively in English, or maybe did you do some journaling
well,
in
yeah.
German?
At some point I probably did, but mostly when I started it was in English. And I don't remember what was that
Ah,
impulse, but I don't have a clear sense of this moment, except that I bought a journal. I knew I was going to travel through Europe by myself. I guess I should get a journal. Of course, I still have that journal. I don't think I have it on my shelf here, but I have a beautiful blanket box that my husband built for me years ago, a pine box, and in it are all of my journals. It's like chock-a-block full. So it's in there. And uh, so it's this blue fabric journal, and I wrote in point form to start, and it just
mhm.
slowly over those 3 months, 3.5 months, I started to write more and more, and sentences grew longer. So by the end, I actually have these big loose leaf pages tucked in because I had finished the journal and I was writing a lot. There was a lot more coming out, and I needed those extra pages. So they're still there, tucked in. And it's really beautiful to read just in that short time, the sense of uh, reflectiveness that I was engaged in, the noticing my experience, the tuning into feelings. Uh, the there was a At the end I had a sense I was in Greece, and I spent some time trying to sum up what the whole experience was about, and I was writing about it. So it's beautiful to have that's still in my life, and to
Yeah.
be able to look back at and go, wow, that was the beginning of my journey with words.
Did you naturally continue journaling from then on? Has your relationship been with journaling since then?
So the second journal, so after I got back, after I got back from Europe, I only spent a few months back in Montreal, and then I got accepted to a year-long program in Israel. So I studied in Jerusalem for almost a year. And that was where I wrote my second journal. And then I came back to Montreal and I wrote my third journal about a year and a half after that, I think. So that was 87, then 87, 88. And then that next journal, I believe I started it, yeah, in the like summer of 89. So there was gaps.
Yeah, and it sounds like initially, at least, it was about journaling when you were somewhere exotic, right? When you were
The first two,
traveling.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Which
But the
makes sense,
third
right?
one, yeah, yeah, exactly. Travel journals. But the third one, I had moved out. I was living in my first bachelor suite downtown Montreal, and I was starting to date this guy that I mentioned briefly, the repertory cinema owner who was a Macintosh fanatic, and this was in 87. No, 89. This was in 89. And he had a big Macintosh computer and he loved it. And he did all of his posters and everything for the cinema on this Mac. And this is like that's a, an early adopter, right? So uh, I was in this relationship. He was 15 and a half years older than me. And I was so confused. I'm like, what is this? What's going on? So I wrote, I bought another journal. I got to write about this. And that's what I wrote. The first page, I write, well, there's a couple things going on. And I thought maybe I'll just write about it. So one is this relationship. Another was I had graduated from my bachelor's degree and I was working at that jazz club and I was volunteering in a listening and referral center. And I had no idea where I was going. So many of my friends were already in medical school or dentist school or starting businesses or whatever. And I had no idea
Being grown-ups,
where I
right?
was. Yeah, exactly. So I had no idea. So I like, well, I got to figure this out. So I'll write about that. And then I was also doing a lot of reading at the time, reading classics. And I would sit in the bath for hours because I worked at night shifts. No, I worked some shifts at night and some during the day, and I would sit in the bath for hours and I keep warming the bath, putting hot water in the bath, and I'd read in the bath. Um, and this was a wonderful brownstone in downtown Montreal, and the bathroom had the black and white tiled floor, and it was wooden floors. It was a very small space. But I loved it because it was my own space, my first own space. It was great. And yeah, and that was my third journal. And I started to chronicle these big decisions and changes in this relationship. And then from then on, I actually never stopped.
Wow.
So that was 89.
Right. Yeah, I certainly have my own thoughts about journaling, and it's been incredibly helpful and useful practice for me. And it's come so naturally at this point that it's sort of like brushing your teeth. Like if you don't do it, if you go for a certain period of time and you haven't brushed your teeth, you feel like, oh, I really need to brush my teeth. That's how journaling kind of feels to me. It's so embedded in my just way of being, and it's just a great go-to way of discovering processing my own experience. And even, they say you write to find out what you think. It's, it's my way of just kind of making sense of things, and questioning things and wrestling with things and documenting things. It has so many purposes and usefulnesses for me.
Mhm.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that about what journaling means to you or how it helps you navigate life?
It was in that third journal that I started to play with poetry.
Mm.
I started to shift how I was writing on the page. I would write way less words, and I started to listen to words, to their sounds and their meanings. So that I can see it. I can actually visually see those pages
Mm.
where I was doing that. And so the journal for me was all those things that you named: a place for reflection, a place for trying to make meaning, a place for grappling with crazy emotions and trying to figure out my life. Who was I? And to remember challenging things from my childhood, so
Mm,
memory, and start to piece that together, understand how might have been influenced by those things. And then, like I said, the language itself, the act of writing too. I love the act of writing. And my writing started to take on different personalities. Like
mm,
if you look at my journals, I have different kinds of writing, and then over time it changed and changed, and I dance on the page with the words. It's
beautiful.
very fluid and it's very nourishing. That is also a part of it for me. There's pleasure in the act of putting the words down.
Mm.
It's a like a choreography of language, a choreography.
So there's dancing and poetry in the mix.
Mm.
And you mentioned also um, recalling childhood events and kind of trying to make sense of them. And you go into this in depth in your book. You dealt with some childhood trauma. And I'll give you the invitation to whatever extent you care to in the context of this interview to touch on that. What was that, and what, looking back, how do you think those incidents shaped the person that you've become and are still becoming?
Mm. Well, I've already given you a sense of the house that I grew up in with these two families. And you already have a sense of what some of the things that were happening in my body with the scoliosis, and then some of the things that were happening in my household in terms of the chaos and the tension between my parents and their fighting. And then there was another layer to that, and that was that my older cousin, who lived upstairs, he was 4.5 years older than me at some point, and I don't exactly know for sure, but started to touch me in a sexual way. And that was incredibly confusing and
Hmm,
also pleasurable. So maybe I was 8 or 9 or 10. One of the things I talk about in the memoir is I identify the posters on the walls in his room, and they were of Charlie's Angels. And if you look up Charlie's Angels, so that was like the late 70s.
hmm,
And in the late 70s, I think late 70s, maybe early 80s, but kind of late 70s. I was 10. I was born in 67. So, I was 12, 10, 11, 12, 13. So it started around then and then went up probably till I was 15. So even while I was wearing these braces,
hmm,
there were moments that he was touching me. I never touched him. And I was very, I mean, I guess as a being, I was sexual as a child. So I also played with myself. I enjoyed my own
hmm.
sexual life as a child. It was a place of pleasure and fantasy for me. And then there was this crazy dynamic with my cousin who never hurt me, but we journeyed in this way, and it was a bit of a seduction scene in his room. And it happened in other places in the house. And one of the confusing things is there was 4 adults in the house and 3 other kids, I guess 2 other kids, and no one ever saw.
Hmm.
But it happened over and over. And so add that to the mix, and there's a lot of stuff going on there in terms of my own sexuality and how I is another paradox, how I was dancing with both the pleasure and the shame and the confusion of it. And I didn't really like my cousin. He was the boy and he was kind of creepy, and so it was really messy. It was really mixed up, and so it certainly affected my sense of relationship and boundaries and my experience, even as a teenager. It wasn't easy for me to be with boys, and I tended toward kind of these not committed relationships. I wasn't very mature socially. Like I had friends who who had boyfriends over long periods of time, but that never happened to me. So I felt there was sadness there. As I say that, I realize, and I don't even think, and I do talk about grief in the book, but as I say that, I feel grief
Hmm.
for the teenager who, because she was in that certain predicament, didn't, there was a certain emotional, I don't know if it was immaturity, but I wasn't, I obviously was not ready for that, but it happened. And it impacted who I was, how I was with my friends. I felt different. And
Hmm.
there was another experience of difference. And I started to tell some of my friends, I think, just a few in my teens. But again, I didn't really have anybody to talk about it. So it was a secret that I carried, right? And that wasn't easy.
Aside from those friends that you mentioned that you might have shared this experience with, did you first start expressing it in your poetry? Is that when you first came to terms with it and kind of faced it, would you say? Or not?
I started to write about it in my journal, I would say. Um, the first group I told about was at Esalen, when I was sitting in circle at Esalen, and started to find language for it, like
Hmm.
incest, right?
Naming it, yeah.
Uh, yeah, so naming it. And I think I read The Courage to Heal at that point, which is a whole book about incest and sexual abuse amongst children, and perpetrated, right, by adults. And uh, I think that was written in 84, if I'm not mistaken, by two Ellen Bass, who became a really beautiful poet, and Laura Davis, these two women who are still writers. But that was revolutionary, that book, The Courage to Heal, bringing that out into the open, because it was secretive. Culturally, it was
Hmm.
secretive. So yes, and then I started to write about it in my poetry. So when I first started to perform my poetry, those were some of the stories that I was performing, which was very brave and very vulnerable. And yet, at the time I was in a new relationship. I was living in Vancouver, and my partner at the time was a musician, and so we started to play with music and poetry together. And so it was part telling the stories as liberation, as expression, as trying to understand it. And it was also an aesthetic expression and a play with language. Uh, and I had a dream one day, one evening, one night, that my cousin, here's another paradox for you, that my cousin lifted me up and I danced. It was like literally he lifted me up and I kind of stood on his hand or something, and I danced better than I ever danced before.
Wow.
Such a strange image. I don't know if that's actually in the book. It might be in the book.
Hmm.
Uh, and it was such a strange dream. So I wrote a poem called The Game. I think that's the poem, was called The Game. He lifted me up. I turned around and around. His hands, sort of something to the air. I let him touch me, let his fingers move from there to there. It felt good inside my body, a new feeling inside my body, warm and tingly. It was a game I learned to play. First, he would touch me, then I would quickly run away. So,
Wow.
little girls aren't supposed to be touched like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, he lifted me up. I wanted up so high I could hear silence and see mountains. So there was something about, because he lived upstairs and there was so much tension in my family, there was something about escape or looking for some kind of pleasure in a uncomfortable. I mean, I was also wearing the braces, right? So there was
Hmm.
that too. And then there was this chaos and tension. And my mom she wasn't happy. She was a stay-at-home mom at that point. My dad, it was a very patriarchal relationship. My dad went out and earned the money, and my mom kind of had to fight for what she wanted to do the money with. And I was the go-between. My mom would say, don't tell him this, tell him this, don't tell him how
Mm.
much we spent. So there was this kind of, it was hard to know who to side with, my mother or my father. And there was a lot of
How old were
yelling.
you when they separated, or?
Okay, this is crazy, but they separated 2 months before my surgery.
Oh, wow.
Because there's a whole other story there there's so many stories, right? We all have so many stories. 2 months before my surgery.
Hmm.
So I was 17 and a half.
So you developed this process called loving inquiry or inquiry.
Mhm,
And I can't help but think that in part it came about as a result of your own experiences and your desire to create a safe space for people. Now, I'm just
mhm,
intuiting here. Um, and also, you experienced for yourself the healing power of creativity and self-expression. But it's a delicate thing, right? Because you have to feel safe enough to be able to express yourself without fear of consequence, or to try to not be too self-conscious, which is something I think creative people of all stripes struggle with. So
mhm,
can you talk a little bit about this process that you developed, how it came about, and anything else you want to say about loving inquiry itself? I know that you have a
mhm,
gate metaphor that's an integral part of
mhm.
it.
Yeah. Well, like I said, when I changed my name to Ahava, and this it was the beginning of this journey of being curious what it, naming myself love with the intention that I wanted to learn how to love myself and others, because I certainly did learn a lot of criticism and a lot of uh, I was really hard on myself in my teens. Not so much in my teens, but as a young adult, 20s. I started to see that. And I developed some patterns. I was very nervous and anxious. I picked my fingers. I ate. I overate. I never purged. My writing was probably my purging. My dancing
Hmm.
was my purging. But I would eat, binge eat, and so there was a lot there. And slowly, through the creative process, through giving voice, through the movement, giving the body a chance to express as freely as it could, I and also through other modalities, through relationship, through finding relationship that was healthier than the ones that I encountered, I started to tap into or see how a different way of being with myself and others was possible. There was love, there was kindness, there was compassion, and that was exciting. And that really has been an ongoing learning for me, because as someone who's been meditating as a Buddhist practitioner, for Buddhist meditation practitioner, insight meditation, 25 years or something, some of this is definitely influenced by the culture and also my family, etc., and what happened, the trauma. And some of it is the nature of the mind, which that it actually can, Rick Hansen likes to say the wolf of love and the wolf of hate. They're both there. Here's another paradox, right? The mind is incredible capacity for creativity and for compassion and empathy and generosity and kindness. And it also has this incredible capacity, as we know, I named the Holocaust, right? I mean, we know in our world, for war, for hatred, for violence, for exploitation, etc. And it can be directed inwardly
Hmm.
as well as outwardly. So the journey was learning about how this mind works and discovering what were the ways that I could lean in toward that wolf of love rather than the wolf of hate, and
To
that's an
feed the wolf of
ongoing
love, right?
feed the
Rather,
wolf of love.
yeah.
Yes, and that is an ongoing learning for me. That will never stop because the mind is a devious thing.
Indeed.
And as much as I practice flexibility with with my writing and with my dance, etc., I also have this propensity to be incredibly afraid of change.
Hmm.
And I get very anxious around change. I like stability. And everything, change is happening all the time. But then, especially when bigger changes, or because maybe this is part of being the creative, I have both. Here's another paradox. This is so amazing. There is a gate of paradox, and I'll come to the gates in a second. But I I love the inquiry. I love the experience of opening and seeing what else is there. This is one of the joys of the journal. It's always a blank page, and we get to see where we go. It's fabulous. At the same time, because it's so unknown and life is so unknown, stepping into new experiences is wrought with uncertainty, which sometimes, like a situation like this, I thrive.
Hmm.
Sometimes I want to hide, and I want to cower. It's so threatening to me. That's a dance that
Sounds very human to me.
yeah, right. So the gates, what happened was, uh, I how do I get there from here? So you said I have a PhD in language and literacy education. So after I published my first poetry book, which was in 98, I moved to a small island. I left Vancouver and moved to a rural island called Salt Spring Island, where I still live. And within the first year, I got a job as a violence prevention, healthy relationship educator in the schools. And for 7 years, I worked and developed this program, a respectful relationship program. So I started to teach young people how to have healthy relationships, boundaries, conflict resolution, etc., anti-racism, anti-sexism, etc. So all these levels. And as I continued that learning, there's the learning, I got so excited about it that I wanted more, and I wanted to keep reflecting more on my own what was I learning as I was teaching. I went back to school and did first a master's degree in narrative inquiry, so using and other arts-based inquiry, and then I continued on because I loved it so much, and that's where I went into the PhD. And I went to so it was arts-based inquiry, meaning that I could use all of my beautiful arts, the dance, the writing, the poetry, the drama, and explore, what does it mean to be in a healthy relationship? What does it mean to be in a loving relationship? And as I was working toward starting writing my thesis, I was lucky enough, dear friends of ours bought this 23-acre farm on Salt Spring. And my new partner and I moved with them to the farm. He was a builder and designer of houses, and he came and we did a whole restoration of the farm, etc. So we took up residence on the farm, these two couples. And we first got there were over 36 gates. 36 is actually a significant number for Jewish people because it's double chai, which means like life. 18, the letters equal numbers. So, but there were a lot of gates. There were these old quirky gates, and I started to walk through the gates because that's the only way you made it through the fields and pastures and gardens. And I started to see how the gate was a beautiful metaphor, because I couldn't just walk through. Like I said, they were quirky. They had their own fasteners. Some of them opened right away. Some of them did not want to open. There was one I had to actually lift up and over because it was like propped up on a log, that rotting log. And there was another. So it became this invitation to stop, pause, pay attention, and then see if anything was in the way before I could walk through.
Wow.
And part of what I was learning about relationship was that stopping and pausing, paying attention to what was in the mind that was coloring my experience of relationship, and how could I move beyond that. So it was a process of opening beyond what I already knew. Here's back to that sense of uncertainty, which we have so many preconceived ideas and expectations that we carry into relationship. And the way the only way to get beyond them is to create some space,
Hmm.
right? To have some openness. And that's what the gate represented for me.
Hmm.
And so as I started to write on the thesis, I started to write poetry. And I was writing about relationships with people, but because I was on a farm, I started to write about relationship with nature, which was not new. I fell in love with nature almost immediately after I moved out of my parents' house. Before that, it was nothing. It wasn't real, wasn't animate. But then I started to spin, and I went to Europe and then Esalen, into these gorgeous places. I moved to the West Coast and I fell in love. So
Nature
I started,
awareness is how I've referred to it recently as a friend, that as a kid I had very little of it. And I grew up in a pretty urban environment as well. And it's only as an adult that I've developed this a greater nature awareness and appreciation and love for it. Yeah.
yeah. So,
I love the gate metaphor, and I love how
yeah.
you have to stop and pause to figure out, what is this gate requiring of you in order to pass through it? Like, you have to, it's an awareness thing. You can't, like, what works in for one gate isn't going to work in the other. And so
Mhm,
that necessity of pausing and
mhm,
assessing and understanding, that's
mhm.
beautiful.
Mm. So when I came time to structure my thesis, which I was writing poetry and narrative, and I was also taking photographs of the farm. So my thesis was an arts-based thesis with these three things. And I called it Loving Inquiry because already I had started to play with idea of learning. I was learning to love, learn in my master's, it was learning love. And when I got to my PhD, there was a class I took in living inquiry. And when I looked at all my field notes for the 3 months of the class, I said, well, my living inquiry is loving inquiry. And that's how I came to call it loving inquiry or inquiry. So and then I moved to the farm. It's like, well, how do I practice loving inquiry on the farm? So that was kind of the question. What is the nature of a loving relationship, and how do I create a loving relationship with nature? And those were some of my questions. So I had the privilege, I had the invitation and the support to write poetry and narrative and take photographs as my research, as my documentation of what I was learning and studying. And then I needed a structure, and I realized that I was photographing the gates and speaking about this process of opening and walking through and what was in the way. So it wasn't until maybe 2 months before I finished, I handed in my third draft, or maybe it was a little bit, that I had the names of the gates. The first draft, I didn't even have the gates. The second draft, I knew I was working with gates, but I didn't know what their names were. And then I had kept a separate file that had uh, qualities of a healthy relationship that I was really noticing, things like listening and compassion, reflection. One of them was play, one of them
Mhm.
was intimacy, paradox was one of them, change, impermanence. I was also influenced and borrowing from my Buddhist practice. So I actually named the gates after those qualities. So it ended up that there were 21 gates in the thesis, and each had a quality. And uh, and that became through the gates of loving inquiry, where the heart opens into relationship. And that was my thesis. And when I graduated, I turned that into a mentorship program to create that safe space for others to be able to walk through the gates and do their own exploring about their relationship with themselves and others, and to access and discover their own creativity. And
So
so
it's all,
yes, like, yeah,
I was going to say, it's all been a journey to discovering and learning about and understanding Ahava, yourself, and love.
yeah, I guess so. That's a nice way of putting it. Yes, it's and continues to be, and because our relationships change and because we live in bodies that change. So I'll speak now to my current experience, because I've been married now for well, we got married 15 years into our relationship, but my husband and I have been together for 22 years. I met him shortly after I moved to the island. And we lived on the farm together for 14 years. And then the pandemic hit, and my husband was really impacted by it. And he started to get a tremor in his arm. And he started to walk funny, and he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2021. No, it was actually 2020. And a new journey began.
Wow.
Of understanding how to live with someone who is ill and who is experiencing a lot of symptoms in their body and struggle, and then how to be a caregiver, because in our relationship, we just chose not to have children. I was the artist, and I was the writer and the scholar, and I went on to publish Writing Alone Together and to do a lot of work with many different populations with writing and creativity. I worked in school with youth, intergenerationally with youth and adults, with women with fused spines, actually, for a while, men in a mental health drop-in center, women in a cafe, lots of different. And then they sold the farm, and we had to leave, and we hadn't bought a place. We were thinking about it, and we missed our chance to buy something at that point. And so
was this during the pandemic, or?
Yeah, this is all during the pandemic. Yeah. So we moved still on the island, and now it's a year and a half since we've living in this new place, which is quite different, but exquisitely beautiful and quiet and great neighborhood. And I am now caring for my partner, and we're discovering together what that looks like. And it's a whole new journey of how to be in relationship. And so my latest last year, I guess, when we started to go on Zoom as a world, because we couldn't be face to face with each other, I started to teach memoir writing. So I created a couple of programs, Woman in Mirror and Immerse Yourself, and worked with mostly women online. And then this year, I'm still doing that. And then with the challenges of being a caregiver and starting to hear how other women were experiencing the challenges and how do you take care of yourself as you're caring for another, I decided to develop a program specifically for caregivers and creativity, and using, because that's what helped me so much besides my meditation practice, is my creativity, and continuing to open into it and expand. And so this program I'm launching actually this week is called Tend Her. And it's bringing creative sanctuary to the stress of caregiving.
Tend, T-E-N-D, and then her,
Yeah.
H-E-R. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which
and
also sounds
enough,
like tender, right?
Yes, and it absolutely does, because it's pretty vulnerable, both being someone who's being cared for, but also being the one who's caring. The heart is tender. The heart is so tender, because there's so much going on and so unpredictable. And so what I am learning is how important it is for me to take care of myself, for me to tend myself as I tend him, because I can't be available really to him the way that I need to be with an open heart. I can't walk through the gates if I'm not tending my own heart. So I was dancing. I know exactly, because this is in my journal. Actually, it's in this journal right here. I can turn to the page. This is one of the beautiful things about writing in a journal. March 8th. So this is so cool, actually, because I said that I developed this program, this mentorship program. It was called A Year to Love. And as a part of that program, the women, the first year I did it, wanted to have their art on the walls of a gallery, one of the women in particular. So we created an art show. And we just celebrated our 10th anniversary. The program doesn't go anymore, but one of the women took on the role of curator, and we kept doing visual art shows on our island here.
Hmm.
And for this particular one, because it was the 10th anniversary, I was exploring, what am I going to do? And she gave us these small frames. We were all using these 10 by 10 frames to do our art on. So in the fall, there's a woman named Krista Tippett who has this beautiful podcast
Oh,
called On
sure. On
Being,
right,
right?
right, right.
Yeah. And she gave a small talk about living the questions, Rilke, inspired by Rilke. And she said that she finds a question that she can live with each year. Not so for the answer as much as to expand into the
Wow.
question and see. So I love that idea. So I started to dream into some questions. And the question that came to me that landed was, who is this dancer? Who is this dancer? And because what I noticed was, and what I've noticed for a long time, but I was especially noticing it, is there some transcendence that happens when I am dancing. There's something more. There we go. There's the more than me who is dancing. So I'm the question, who is this dancer?
Hmm. Almost like
And
in meditation, who is the observer?
yeah, yeah. And so I wrote that at the top of the page, and I put some music on and started to dance, because that's what I do, right? And I started to write, because I also inquire, well, what am I doing here? What's going on? So I wrote, feel, play, soft, love, tender, and then I wrote, tend her. And what I noticed was, and then I kept going, rhythm, repetition, pause, listen, 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 try, feel, swing, body, feel good. And I just kept going. But then I was intrigued by this tend her, because what I noticed was I was giving myself the space to feel and to express and to process through the dance. And so that's where the idea of tend her came. That part of me, that that vulnerable, tender part of me needed expression. So tending her, and it stuck. And so that's where the title comes from. Tend her.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's almost like a directive from that
Mhm.
transcendent self to tend her, to tend to, right?
Yeah. Yeah, to tend to this, tend her can be the muse, her can be the body, the spirit, the soul. Her can be that vulnerable child, the one who I spoke
Who
of
we carry
before
with us
around.
for life.
Absolutely, the one I touched into the grief around, that yeah. So tend her. So it's yeah, it starts in middle of June, and it's a 3-month online guided journey. And I'll do what I do. We'll walk through the gates together. And
So this would be a good segue into asking you where listeners or viewers of this podcast can go to learn more about this program and any other of your offerings. Where would you direct them?
well, I have a website, and it is lovinginquiry.com. So if you go there, then you can read about Tend Her. And you can also sign up for my newsletter. And I send a weekly newsletter, and I send poems and stories and prompts
Hmm.
and invitations to programs. And what else? I'm not much. Somehow I've managed to not have a cell phone and never have a cell phone. But I do
Ever,
have, like,
ever.
no.
Astounding. I am so impressed.
Yeah. So but I do have a device now, because I'm actually doing a business mastermind program as I keep moving out into the world with my offerings in this new way through online work. And I needed a WhatsApp so we could connect with my my cohort.
So
So
that's the only
uh,
app on that device?
no, I've got
Okay,
lots.
okay, okay.
I've got lots. And I'm touching into Instagram now. So my
Hmm.
Instagram is ahava.shira. So that's my name, ahava.shira. And I'm playing with videos and stuff, singing a little bit and being in nature and talking about, the joys and healing of the of writing and the work I do, and also that tender, delicate process of caring for ourselves as we care for others.
Hmm. Hava, thank you so much for everything that you shared. It's been a fantastic dialogue with you. We could, I'm sure, continue this for some time, and I have some questions that I didn't get to, but I feel like the conversation sort of led us in a particular direction. And I'm struck by the ways in which you've incorporated the happenings of your life into your work. You've taken your experiences, and as life hands you difficult ones, you have managed to forge something creative out of them, and then you in turn offer what you've learned to others and to help them navigate their own challenging situations through the arts and through community, and through self-expression. So I want to just salute you for that and honor you for that. And I really appreciate your forthrightness, and I know that this memoir, maybe if you want to talk about, I don't know where it is in the process of publishing, but you shared it or pieces of it with me before it saw the general light of day, which I was very honored to receive. And it really is a beautiful example of self-expression, and creating something of beauty out of the mixture of experience, this paradox that we keep coming back to, that is life.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to offer anything else, either in discussing the future of the memoir or anything else that you wish to share before we close this
Like
out.
it's Yeah, okay, a couple of things. One is that it's that paradox that I talked about, both the intuitive, authentic impulse to share and express, and then that anxiety and fear that artists have and humans have.
Right.
And so there's been, in writing this memoir, which took about 5 years, and I worked with I did it by myself, and I worked with some writing friends and a professional editor and copy editor, and then sent it out. I've only sent it out to about maybe 6 or 8 publishers. So, but it hasn't been accepted. So I kind of brought it back in. And so it was actually a gift for you to ask to read it, and for
Hmm.
me to decide, let's just play around here a little bit. Let's go in there and see what happens if I pull some pieces out that feel particularly meaningful to me at this time. So I believe what I'm going to do is, with this, I feel emboldened, empowered to look what I gave you and then see how I can actually shape the memoir again around those and see what happens, because I wasn't fully happy with the form that had come in. And so let's see. I'm hoping that it will that I will be sharing it soon. And again, this talking through things with you has been very encouraging for me.
Hmm.
And so I do want to share it very much. And I'm also in the middle of editing my second memoir, which I started to write when my husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and we had to leave the farm. And so that also is in process.
Hmm.
And yeah, I'm in the middle of that one too. So I don't know when that one will be ready. So I don't know when either of them will be ready. And sometimes I put pressure on myself because I think, oh, I'm 56 years old. These should be done already. And
Watch out for should. Watch out for that
I
word.
know, I know. I hear you. I so
Yeah.
hear you. So they will come out, and the best thing to do is follow me on Insta. I'll let you know.
There you
Or,
go.
sign up for my newsletter. Uh, People have said it's incredibly inspiring, and you'll know as soon as I know when the memoirs will be ready. I also have a novel in
Oh,
the
wow.
works that I started to write during the pandemic about a teenage dancer who is using her dance to grieve her brother who is dying and then dies. And that was the joy to be working on during that time. So that one's not finished yet either. So I'm in the middle of a lot of
You're in
writing.
process.
I am definitely in process, excitedly, sometimes dauntingly in process. Yeah.
It's been a pleasure and a delight. Thanks for everything, Ahava. And I will include in the show notes links to your website, your Instagram, and anything else that you care to share. And I just want to again thank you so much for the time today um, and for giving us a sense of what it is to be Ahava.
Oh, being Hava. I want to say thank you so much, Eric. This has
Mm.
been such a joy. It's kind of like a good journal writing session, because you don't know. I didn't know what it was going to be. You didn't share any of the questions beforehand, so I had no idea. And yet you invited me into inquiry, into a loving inquiry about my life. And I got to choose which pieces I could explore and reflect on, and then see the threads and how they wove, and some new ways of seeing my life,
Mm.
with this attention to this paradox, which came up a lot, and also this sense of more, which is
Mm.
fascinating. And then the whole, yeah, and the many paradoxes that we touched on together. So what a thrill, what a joy to be able to do this. I think everybody should have a chance to be your interviewee, because you have a very calm and engaging and very gentle and safe way of drawing out uh, the conversation. Your curiosities is wonderful. Very, very, yeah. So thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
inviting me and